Thank you. This is a 2-hour talk. It's a one-day talk. I have to do it in 30 minutes. So I have to go fast and decide what to tell you. There's a whole lot to say, but I want to take a moment and talk a little bit about my background because that'll help you understand where I'm coming from here. As Rachel said, in the 1970s, we were trying to get the protocols to work. In the 1980s, when I chaired the Internet Activities Board, we dealt with this problem of making the Internet big. We had this horrible realization in the early 1980s. We were ambitious. We wanted to hook all the computers together, but we thought there might be 100,000. And then we saw the PC, and we said, oh, rude word. There are 100 million, not 100,000. So we had to scale. And we scaled the routing. We scaled the naming system. That's the domain name system. We scaled our management organization. And then in the 1990s, I decided to design some augments to the Internet to create what's called quality of service so that we could do gaming and telecommunications, live teleconferences and so forth, make that work better. And we designed all these protocols. They're called diffserv and intserv and all that kind of stuff. And after we got this done, I went to Cisco and said, hey, this is cool stuff. You should put it in your router. And they said, find me a customer. So I said, is that my job? Yeah. So I went to the largest ISP, and I said to the CTO, hey, this QoS stuff is really cool. You should turn it on in your network. And he said, no, which was a clear answer, but the wrong one. And I said, why? And he said this wonderful sentence. You've got to listen to this carefully. It was 1995. He said, why should I spend money to turn on quality of service so Bill Gates can make money selling Internet telephony for Windows? And I said, it's about money. And at that moment, I realized the technologists were not in charge of the future. And further, I realized we'd created a structural problem. The interface of the Internet, which is this IP layer, has a money insulator in it. It's hard to get money to flow across that. And the money gets spent down below, and it gets made up above. There's a discontinuity. And I was talking to an economist, and he said to me, Dave, I've told this story before. If you've ever heard me give this talk, you've heard this story, but it's a good story. He said, Dave, the Internet's about routing money. Routing packets is a side effect. And you screwed up, that's not the word he used, and he screwed up the money routing protocols. And I said, I didn't design any money routing protocols. And he said, that's what I said. So I hired an economist, and my group became multidisciplinary. I've had a political scientist that works for me. I collaborate with lawyers because I'm trying to understand what's going on here. And I'm going to talk about I guess it's currently 11 forces that are shaping the future of the Internet. And the important point is most of them are not technical. So I come here from a technical university saying, sorry, it's about things like money. But that shouldn't surprise you. Look where we are. So here's the first of my forces. These are what I call the 5 C's. And I mentioned the first one already. This is old news. Commercialization of the Internet happened in 1995. Prior to that, it was run by the National Science Foundation and DARPA. And it was sort of benign. We didn't have to worry about where the money came from because our parents paid for it. And all of a sudden, it got commercialized. And from then to now, we've been worrying about how to route the money so that all parts of the ecosystem are healthy. Let me give you an example of this. I put coopetition up there, which is this neologism that was created to talk about the fact that companies that are fierce competitors have to cooperate in order to make the Internet work. Verizon and Comcast are fierce competitors, but they have to interconnect to share traffic, and so they have this problem. And this became very clear when I tried to get this quality of service stuff pushed out. And I got some of these ISPs in a room. I got them around. MIT has a neutral table. I said, here's my neutral table. Come sit around the table. Let's talk about whether we can deploy quality of service. I had to say, okay, money's off the table. We're not talking about money routing. That's too scary. I understand. Let's just talk tech. And they said, well, okay, so we want to provide a service that's got a bounded delay or a delay commitment. And then they said, oh, my God, what happens if we make a service level agreement and then it fails? Whose fault was it? We have to figure out whether it was this ISP's fault or this ISP's fault. And they realized they were going to have to open up more information to each other about the internals of their network, and they walked away from the deal. They could have made money, but they weren't prepared to share that much information with their competitor. Now, in contrast, I have up here centralization. Now, we're not going to centralize the Internet. I don't think there's anybody up there. Even our big firms today can't buy all the Internet and run it. But if you look at the higher levels, Facebook, Google, centralization is actually, in the context of the business I'm in, a natural form. If you build a centralized app, it's actually easier to design it because you don't have to go to standards meetings for 5 years. You can evolve it quickly because you just get 6 people in the room and say, let's do this, and they go off and change the code. You can solve security problems quickly. And of course, if you live in a capitalist society, it's much easier to monetize. I gave this talk yesterday and discovered I was arguing with a Marxist, but that probably won't happen here. But how could you monetize Facebook if it was 100,000 firms all cooperating with each other? Now, our original vision of the internet was highly distributed applications, and the obvious example of this is email. And it's important to look at what's happening to email today. As the protocols get more complicated, especially because of security, and the implementations become more entangled, it's turning out that most companies have discovered they really don't want to cope with the complexity of running their own email server. A lot of email today is being served by one of 3 providers, right? It's either Google, Microsoft, or Yahoo. And if one of them blinks, we'll have only 2. And email was the ultimate distributed application, and the forces, these are not malicious forces, these are natural forces, are causing it to become centralized. Related to that, of course, is consolidation. Why is there one Facebook? Okay, well, wouldn't you want to be on the same social network as all your friends? There are more. There's LinkedIn and a few, but a lot of them just died. MySpace just died. You don't want a fax machine that doesn't interoperate with everybody else. You don't want to be the only person that owns Betamax. This is an understood phenomenon. The economists call it a network effect or a tipping effect. The market tips toward a winner. Winner take most. Well, guess what? I built a network. So you should expect to find apps that have a network effect. I mean, duh. And so there's natural forces here towards centralization. Centralization doesn't mean physically centralized. You can have servers all over the world. I mean, centralized in terms of control. There are natural forces that point towards centralization, toward consolidation. And of course, what I mean by convergence is, well, let's see, I'm a social network. Why don't I get into video distribution? Well, I'm into video distribution. Why don't I get into social networking? Why don't we all try to do everything? Let's try to take each other's markets going sideways. And what you would expect to find in this place is that firms that have a large market share, and notice you can capture market share very quickly in a tipping world, take that market base they have and try to expand into new markets. Okay. This, by the way, as an aside, is giving people who think about the role of antitrust fits. And in fact, there is an argument going on today about whether the current interpretation of antitrust has anything to do with the markets that we're in here, but I don't have time to talk about that. Let me just take a quick aside here, because I talked about money routing. It is, in fact, an accident that much of the internet experience grew up as an advertising supported activity. It didn't have to be that way. But I think some of the consequences of this are fairly pernicious. I don't think I have to elaborate on this in this room. When you use Facebook, you are not a customer, you're the product, and they're grooming you to sell you to the advertisers. This has led to an erosion of privacy, and it's led to a tremendous desire on their part to make you sticky, to have you look at a lot of things so they can serve you a lot of ads, they can sell you over and over and over again. And of course, the consolidation factor here shows up in the economics of advertising. Facebook and Google together are capturing about half of all the advertising spend in the United States, online advertising spend. And furthermore, there's limited room for growth. This is really important. Advertising spend is controlled by marketing managers in firms. You can do a really great job of capturing more of the advertising revenue, but it's really hard for you as a Facebook or a Google to grow the advertising spend because that's not under your control. So, yeah, there are loops that are causing advertising spend to grow, but in the short run, you're really fighting over a fixed-size pot of money. And the more Facebook gets the money and the more Google gets the money and the fastest grower in that space is Amazon, what are we doing? We're squeezing out all the other guys, okay? Which means we're generating all kinds of pushback in this space. There are people saying this is unstable. There are people who are saying that the use of our data is inappropriate. There's all kinds of stuff going on here. And then the last fact I put up here, there's a paper on this. I don't have time for citations in this talk, but there's a paper that pointed out if you look at the economics of these small guys who run websites and want to post ads, they looked at the details of the system and said, those guys actually don't make much more money by targeted ads. More money is being spent, but they're not getting it. So I have a prediction, which is that over the next small number of years, there's a significant chance that the advertising ecosystem here is going to suffer a major implosion. I think there are going to be a lot of people who say, I can't live on this anymore. We can't stand the use of our personal information. And, well, what's going to happen? It depends on what money routing protocols emerge. And now you have to look for other models. Well, we do have another model. We can see it in the internet today. Unfortunately, it's just as pernicious. That's what I would call the tipping model, or the I've lost the word I want. There are organizations. Sorry, this is not pernicious. There's an organization called Patreon, and if you're a creative person and you have a website, you can put Patreon on there, and it says, if you like what I do, you're welcome to give me a donation. And people do pay for creative people that they like. And of course, Patreon's a profit-seeking company. They take a share. Commission was the word I was looking. They take a commission, and well, that's an alternative. And you can see other examples of this. The site where people go to watch other people play computer games. Okay, Twitch. Well, playing a game's a sport. We all watch sports, so why shouldn't you watch geeks play games? Okay. There's a character. He started out on Twitch. He's got a YouTube channel. He's called PewDiePie. He's got 100 million followers, and they tip him. And weird stuff happens. Go look up on Wikipedia. Look up PewDiePie. Okay. It's all about money routing. Who's going to design the next generation of money routing protocols here? Let me tell you an industry that solved this problem. I'm looking at my clock down here. Let me tell you an industry that solved this problem. You want to look for an industry that fiercely competes except when it comes to collecting money, and that's the music industry. They are fierce competitors in terms of bringing their grooming their stars and bringing them to market, but when it comes to collecting money, they circle the wagons, they cooperate, and they're damn sure they're going to get their royalties and find anybody who's illegally sharing infringing content. When music is performed in public, when a restaurant plays music, that is public performance, and therefore there has to be a royalty paid. Okay. And that's done through the collective rights management organizations. There are two of them in the United States, ASCAP and BMI. And what does ASCAP and BMI do? It routes money. It takes money from all the places where performance happens. It comes up with an approximation of which of the composers, lyricists, and performers should get the money. It routes the money to them. It solves the money routing problem. The industry said, it's not perfect. Everybody said, of course it's an approximation, but we need to route the money to make this work. They've come together and they've sorted out how to do it. And by the way, if you perform music in public and you don't have a license from ASCAP or BMI, you're going to get sued. They're really good at that. Okay. So let me go on and talk about some more of my forces here. I hinted at privacy. I'm not going to say a lot about it because everybody is talking about it all the time. It's such a hot topic I had to put it in the list. But notice, privacy would not be such a hot topic if it weren't for the fact that we had gone in this direction of the advertising-sponsored ecosystem. If we'd had a different money routing protocol and you were paying, it might not have been such a hot topic. By the way, this is a fact you need to know, which is how much are you worth to the advertisers? It's too large a room to do a survey, but sometimes it's important to just have an intuition about actual numbers. If you take the total advertising spend in the United States and you divide online advertising spend, which is about half of the total spend, advertising online is now past video. The line's crossed. It scared the hell out of the video people. But if you take the online spend and you divide by the number of internet users in the United States, per month, you're worth on the average $26, $27. Does that seem like a lot or a little? Well, the total online advertising spend in the United States is about $100 billion. Well, that sounds big until you look at the size of individual corporations in this space. All of this fight on that previous slide that I was talking about is not that much money, and that's paying for all of the internet-free experience, okay? That's one of the reasons why I think there could be an implosion here. But I don't want to elaborate on privacy because, in some sense, everybody's talking about privacy. The next item on my list is malice and adverse interests. The thing that people would normally put there is security, but I actually, I could give a 4-hour talk on security or insecurity. I'm not going to. Don't get scared. But I actually don't like the word security because it implies that there's a state that we're not in. We are currently in an insecure state, and if we did something, we could be in a secure state. And my security friends at MIT who talk about technology say, yeah, well, what's the definition of a secure system? The definition of a secure system is one that meets its specification, even when it's under attack. I said, okay. Does that make it trustworthy? Look at the specification. There is no specification for Facebook. What does correct operation of Facebook mean? I mean, and by the way, we have lots of components of the internet where the specification of the internet, the specification of that component includes risky behavior. When people came up with this idea of adding to the web the active download of active code, every security person I knew was standing on the sideline saying, stupidest idea you've ever heard, you're all going to die, you're all going to die, stupid, stupid, stupid idea. And everybody said, oh yeah, but we can have animated dancing cats. And guess what? Function won out over security. Okay. So we have a well-specified mechanism for doing this incredibly risky thing. We tell your kids, don't take candy from strangers. Why would you take active code from a stranger? And there's a deep truth here. In the people say, why didn't you think about security in the early days of the internet? We did. We had to figure out what it meant to think about security. We didn't know. Nobody had ever worked this out. But in the early days, like 70, something like that, I was talking to somebody at NSA, and he was the guy who invented the idea of malicious code. He called it Trojan horse software. And he said, I'm only 2 decades ahead of my time. I said, right. His name was Dan Edwards. But he said, looking at code to decide whether it's malicious is a fool's errand. If you're going to download code from somebody, the only way you can build a stable system is to make sure you know who you are and you have a rational belief in for trusting them. Downloading code from a friend of yours, if a friend hasn't themselves been corrupted, good idea. Downloading code from a stranger, stupid idea. So instead of putting up here security, the more fundamental point is we've built a global system, and we have to accept the fact that within that system, just like in the offline world, there are malicious actors and actors whose interests are adverse to ours, and they're in the system and we can't eject them. And so we have to figure out how to build a system in which we can have a trustworthy experience, which is different than a secure experience, even though these actors are part of our ecosystem. Okay. And there are some key systems of the internet itself. I'm not talking about applications. There are some key systems. The global routing system of the internet, which is called Border Gateway Protocol, you may never have heard of it, but I'm going to tell you that it's critical to the way the internet works, and it's got a horrible security flaw in it, which we identified in 1982. Why is it that we have a system on the internet today that has a flaw in it that we identified in 1982 that we haven't fixed yet? That tells you it's not a technical problem. If it was a technical problem, we would have fixed it. It has to do with disagreement about approach. Nobody's in charge of a distributed system. There is no king, no czar. I gave a talk in 1992 to the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, in which I said, we reject kings, presidents, and voting. It became their mantra. I didn't mean it as a compliment. Whenever anybody stands up and says, let me offer to lead, we kill them prophylactically. Okay. So you end up in 5-year consensus meetings. And in fact, there was a committee to try to improve the security of BGP that met for 5 years and had to be disbanded because they couldn't agree. I don't want to say my security friends are disagreeable, but boy, do they like to disagree. And if somebody was in charge, you say, okay, let's just do this. Okay. And we're still fighting over it. I think we're at a time where we actually have a solution for BGP that we can actually begin to deploy. I won't bother to talk about it, but the domain name system's got similar problems. There's something called the certificate authority system, which you may never have heard of, but it's how you're sure you actually got to the website you meant to get to. That's got problems. Okay. That's what I work on, by the way, is trying to figure out how to get people to think about how we can make these systems more trustworthy, given that there are malicious actors within the system. And that's not traditional security research, but that's one of the things I do. Next thing on my list here is platform assets. What do I mean by that? I'm speaking Gook, of course, there. In the early days, if you wanted to build an application, we said, here's the internet. Oh, and by the way, we gave you this system called the domain name system that converts names to numbers. Have a good time. And you can put your real code on your computer, and I can put my code on my computer. If you build an app today, you're using a tremendous range of assets. And platform is a buzzy word today, platform, especially if it's multi-sided platform. Ooh, I just said something magic. You have cloud. You have content delivery networks. You have networks that aren't the internet. This is really important. There are lots and lots of global networks today built out of internet technology that aren't the internet. They hook enterprise to cloud. They hook parts of a corporation together. They can give you global connectivity. And guess what? A lot of traffic is going over those networks today and not the public internet. Why? Because you can get things like better security and quality of service. Okay. The role of the public internet is actually emerging as I would say, a critical but only a small component of the total ecosystem in which these things now work. The public internet is I don't want to say retail because that sounds like I'm in the capital business, but it is the citizen, it is the person facing, it's how you hit the home, it's how you hit your mobile phone. But fairly quickly, you are jumping off that into a much more complicated ecosystem that's got servers and cloud and everything in it like that. Now, if you're the government, they still think that what they need to do is pay attention to the internet. And they say, blah, 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 regulate the internet, blah, blah, blah. Okay. No, that's a small part of the current ecosystem. Okay. If you're an app developer, you understand this. Okay. Now, I said the future's not driven by technology. I put technology up here. There are a couple things that are happening today that are sort of exciting. The obvious one is 5G, which is riding the Gartner hype curve. And it'll land in an inch. I remember when 4G went through the same thing, and people said, oh, it's nothing but hype. Oh, my God, it's nothing but hype. And 4G turned out to be something that's useful. But in fact, the 5G people have now come out and said, oh, well, maybe for the consumer in their smartphone, it isn't going to make any difference. Okay. So we have to see what 5G grows up to be. That's all right. So I don't dismiss technology, but I see it as only one of the forces that's shaping the world here. I think globalization is something that we really need to pay attention to. The internet we always aspired for the internet to be global, but in the beginning it was very US-centric. Actually, the physical circuits came out from the US and was sort of spider web-like, with the US at the center. Now it's this tremendous mesh. Less and less of the traffic is flowing through the United States, which of course makes the rest of the world happy. And what we discover with globalization is first, it is more and more obviously coming into focus that not all of the actors in this ecosystem have interests that are aligned with us. China's conception of what the internet should be is entirely different than our conception of what the internet should be. They want much more control over content, and they recruit other countries that have a similar view. There are lots of countries that say, oh, you mean I can build an internet in which I can control whether people criticize the leader? Oh, I like that. Sure, let's do that. It was John Perry Barlow, one of our crazed visionaries, and I say that with love, who said of the internet, freedom of speech is a local ordinance in cyberspace. And the other point about globalization is it makes the governance problem much, much worse. It used to be when the United States was sort of exercising a leadership role, which is completely atrophied at this point for a variety of reasons. We had some ability to push the internet in a certain direction. Now nobody can push the internet in any direction. We have organizations that are supposed to be multi-stakeholder, the one called ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. That's the organization that's got responsibility for the domain name system. And you can go study them and figure out what actually pushes them in one direction or another. By the way, the snarky answer is money routing. Okay, fine. So how do you actually make a change in the internet? How do you govern this global space? Well, China has an answer, by the way. China's answer is something this important should be controlled by governments. And they would turn to an organization that is older than the United Nations, but is attached to the United Nations for convenience. It's called the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. And they say the international connectivity of the internet should be determined controlled by the ITU. And the critical resources of the internet should be controlled by the ITU. And, by the way, it's a treaty organization, so the way they make decisions is one country, one vote. So accumulating a voting bloc from the developing world is a very powerful asset if what you'd like to do is control the internet using the ITU. And a few years ago, there was a rather savage meeting in which there was a debate as to whether the treaty that governs the ITU should be expanded so they had authority over the international character of the internet. A lot of the countries of the world voted yes. The United States and Western Europe voted no. Nothing really came of it, but this is not over. We're going to fight over governance because we have to figure out how to deal with this space of globalization. And finally, that brings me in my list to the role of government. And I want to point out that this transition that occurred in 1995, when NSF stopped running the core of the internet, what was NSFNet, National Science Foundation, very benignly ran this network for the benefit of their academic users, the government sort of stepped back and said, we don't know what the internet is, we're going to watch it, we're going to let it grow up. And I remember talking to one of the chairmen of the FCC, I don't remember which one it was, and he said, look, Dave, you got to understand, we're not regulating the internet because we don't know what it is, but if it ever grows up, it's going to get regulated, and you better just think about that. And so we've gone through a period now where, in some sense, the governments deliberately left it alone to see what it would be. And I would say that the internet grew up and society doesn't like what it is. They don't like the fake news. They don't like the fear that it's actually got the power to influence elections. They don't like the fact that it's capturing this personal information. And, you know, we left it to the private sector, and this is what we got. And people are saying, ooh. And I'm going to assert that right now we are at a time of transition which is as important as the transition from NSFNet to the sort of unregulated, laissez-faire commercial world, which is increased government attempt to regulate the internet. But this space is fraught with confusion because the internet is global, the major apps are global, Facebook, Google, and regulation is within the scope of a jurisdiction. So you find today Europe waking up and pushing some of these global companies in one direction, while in other parts of the world they're being pushed in another direction. And companies and regulators are going to have to figure out how to deal with this. But here's a list of things that I think government is concerned about. Loss of privacy, obviously. Okay? A lack of trust, obviously. Abusive behavior on the internet, obviously. Crypto behavior doesn't just mean cryptocurrency. It means behaviors deliberately designed to allow anonymous behavior in the face of people who think that it should be regulated. National security, obviously, we have concerns about whether something like the internet could actually be used to seriously damage critical infrastructure. Concentration of power, I don't think I have to rely. Erosion of democracy, there's a lot of concern about the role of the big players in not just influencing elections, but in reshaping how people think about their relationship to society. Taxation, oh, how could anybody forget about that? And these are all compounded by global issues. Governance, as I said, how do you govern a global institution of this sort? What do you do? How do regulators think about it? Differing conceptions of the internet, I talked about that. Cross-jurisdictional law enforcement. This is tactical and it's nasty. Let's say you discover that somebody in some, you know, what is Dilbert? Albonia? Somebody in Albonia is launching an attack against the routing system of the internet and is taking traffic, let's say, that is destined for Citibank and trying to cause it to go to Albonia so they can look at it. Okay? We have no extradition treaties with Albonia. For all you know, the Albanian government is making money off these people and, in fact, is encouraging them to behave in this way. Even if you're dealing with two countries that have similar rule of law, how do you trigger law enforcement in another country? There's a formal procedure in which you ask for help from another country in a criminal proceeding. It's called an MLAT, a mutual legal aid, something or other. And you start at your police department, you go up to the State Department, you go across through. And I asked somebody in the United States, when you get an MLAT from a country that we respect, how long does it take you to respond to it? And they said, well, on the average, it takes 9 months, maybe 2 years. You can't prosecute anything, okay? So I want to put up just a couple slides about what does it mean to do research in this space, because I'm going to run out of time here. We do measurement. We try to understand what's actually happening. We try to measure abusive attacks on the routing system. We try to measure abusive behavior in the DNS system so that we can understand what's going on. Okay? We encourage people to do technology development that's motivated by social and policy concerns. Sometimes this has to do with the architecture of the system. Sometimes it has to do simply with giving application designers design patterns to say if you did this kind of thing, it might be more benign than if you did that kind of thing. I can't give you examples. Development of policy options. And of course, part of it is just explaining to people what's going on, going to Washington and talking to people who don't know what is going on at all, but understand they ought to be worried about it. I had a slide here in which I elaborate, and I don't think I have time to play with this. We've done a lot of work in this space, and I would say, I need to put in just a little plug here. Boy, is it hard to get this research funded. Sorry. You know, if I could pass the hat, I would pass the hat. It doesn't look like research to the National Science Foundation. DHS actually funded some of this work, and guess what? They blew it all up and decided it was not part of their mission. Europe is actually way ahead of us here. They're going to lead, both in trying to think through security and in thinking through regulation, if we don't decide that we actually care. But everybody I know who's working in this space, a researcher working in this space, is running on fumes, and it's really upsetting me. Okay. But let me finish with a slide that says, what do you mean to you? Now, I don't know who's in the audience here, but obviously the answer is, what does it mean to you depends where you sit in the ecosystem. What platforms do you depend on? Do you depend on cloud? Do you depend on the DNS? Can those systems be used against you? Almost certainly yes. Okay. What are your barriers to growth? Are any of them embedded in the character of the internet, or is this irrelevant to the particular business you have? What coordination problems do you face? Most companies are building centralized solutions because they're easier to build. Okay. Can your market tip? That's an obvious question for any business person to think about. And you need to look at the future through that lens. Are you global in scope? And finally, this comment that I made, which is, how is regulation going to affect you? And I really cannot stress this enough. I think that in the next few years, government is going to involve itself in the character of the internet in a way that's very different than what we've seen. This is a point of transition, and it's going to be a messy transition. It's going to be a transition marked by a lot of false moves and confusion, and people don't know what they're talking about, and coordination problems, and it's going to be a big mess. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. Okay. So with that, and the fact that in a room this big I can't pass the hat, which I would like to do because I'm starving. My grad students are starving. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to take some questions. So, and I believe we have a mechanism to do this, and we're going to see whether it works.
Please go to www.pigeonhole.at for your questions. There are also people with microphones at the edges, so if you raise your hand...
I must have said something provocative. Come on.
The key event password is MIT19NYC if you're using Pigeonhole.
Oh, I see some things coming up here. This is cool. And I see votes
Terrific.
Coming up. Okay.
Good. So you can choose which questions you would
God.
like to answer.
Oh, the one's getting all the votes. Wow, that's the pop. Okay. So the one that's getting the most votes very rapidly is, would you say that WeChat is a money routing mechanism that should be replicated or supported given that it's app-based, company-controlled, and Chinese-based? Can I unpack that for a moment? First of all, WeChat is a very fast-growing application. If you use the internet in China, you don't say to yourself, I'm using the internet in China. What you say is, I use WeChat. It is a platform layer which is as powerful as the iPhone or the Android layer below it. And if you want to develop an app in China, you basically have to work with WeChat to develop the app because you really want to use their interface, not the Android interface. You call a taxi you pay people, all these kind of things, you do it inside WeChat. Powerful, powerful app, and they're now expanding globally. It is a money routing protocol, but I don't think it's the money routing protocol that I want. Platform operators have tremendous power. We see the power of the platform operators to influence the people that sit on top of them. In business circles, these people are called complementers. And we see the power of the platform operator to manipulate, well, that's a harsh word, to shape the behavior of the system on top. I do not think platform operators make the best money routing protocols. I think I would be much happier if that was in some sense divorced from the platform, but I can see why it might work out this way. So, one question is, am I concerned about WeChat because it comes from China? I think we should not be over shrill in that space, but we should think about it. That's different from its architecture, in which they've somehow managed to establish this dominant position that actually overlays the operating systems of the phones and creates an entirely different space in which you have to innovate your apps. And that has nothing to do with the fact, well, unless the Chinese did something magic that I don't understand, that is not necessarily just because it came from China. Let's see what else we got here. Give me another one. That got 20 votes. Wow. People are learning how to use this system. Why are smart contract platforms running on top of blockchain struggling to route money for all? Where does distributed blockchain fit into your 5C? Okay, so I'm sorry. First of all, yeah, I sort of understand blockchain. But I'm not a blockchain expert. But I'm cynical enough to say that I don't think blockchain is pixie dust that you sprinkle on a problem to make it go away any more than competition is. There's a lot of things tangled up in this question. Why are smart contract platforms running on top of blockchain struggling to route money? I'm trying to unpack that question. I'm a little, so what can I say about smart contract? Smart contract is this idea that we can make a agreement between the two of us that's embodied in rules that are sufficiently specific that in fact automatically or algorithmically the system can determine whether the rules are fulfilled and therefore the transaction ought to occur. And it's this, I'm oversimplifying and perhaps getting it wrong, but it's this idea that we can reduce our interactions to an algorithmically scripted sequence. And I was actually in a meeting earlier this week with a bunch of lawyers. Now, of course, if the whole world was running on smart contracts, maybe it would put all the lawyers out of business. No, a subset of the lawyers out of business. So perhaps I should take what they said with a grain of salt, but they said, look, contracts in between real world people don't look like that, okay? There's always a process of interpretation. That's what, when you really get into a dispute, that's what common sense and judges and courts and juries do. And the idea that we can take a significant number of the relationships that we have between each other and reduce them to algorithmic specification such that a piece of software can determine whether the contract has been fulfilled is a technological fantasy. Now, is that true? I don't know. But I have to say that that's the limit of my exposure to that place, and I really don't want to play with it. How can we, as your average internet user, regain control as customers without consistently sacrificing our privacy? Right now, it's not under your control. I mean, you say, I'm sorry, my answer is, you're not going to like my answer, which is, well, don't use Facebook, right? And try, what happens if you don't use search? You know, we have become dependent in this space. And you talk to people and I say, are you happy? And say, oh, no, this is really frustrating me, it's making me unhappy. I said, well, then stop doing it. Well, I couldn't do that. And we really, I think we as users need to find, as individual users, I don't know what we can do. We have to, but that's why governments are getting excited. And all I can say, I'm going to take one more question and then I'll see that. But when Elizabeth Warren, I'm not campaigning here, when Elizabeth Warren says, as one of the planks in her campaign platform, that we should break up Facebook, she is tapping into a very deep populist sense. And the fact that she thinks it's important enough to say that early on in her campaign suggests how significant the concern here. Now, I think break up is the wrong thing to do, and I hope we don't get trapped into a space where that's what we have to do. But the regulators have to figure out what to do. I'm going to take one more question here, and then I'll stop because it says 0. But do you think the GDPR, the European Privacy Directive, is a good first step toward internet governance? Well, it's not a step toward governance. Well, it's one step toward governance, and yes, I think it's a good first step. And a lot of people say, yeah, we're going to have to fix it. It's a trial run. There are a lot of things about it that are right. There are a lot of things about it that are wrong. And I think we're going to tune this. Right now, Europe is leading. A lot of companies are saying, you know, I can't deal with privacy in different parts of the world differently, so let's just assume the GDPR applies globally. So they're leading. So do I think it's a good first step? Yes, I actually do. I've read it. It's 88 pages long.